All right, we are in the last stretch of our stress and worker well-being lecture, talking about violence and aggression at work. It's kind of a niche topic here, but it's something that has a group of researchers who really study it thoroughly because even though real violence at work is actually quite rare, it is definitely a big deal. Of course, if you have someone get hurt because of violence and aggression, it's something that really stands out and really matters and makes a difference, so we want to prevent it. So we definitely look into it despite its uncommon nature. So workplace violence, although it is rare, is kind of becoming more prevalent, at least in the way we study it. And sometimes it's from a non-employee to an employee. Sometimes it's from an employee to another employee. But those are the two types usually. It's almost unheard of that it's a employee to a non-employee, but very um, more common for these two ways of a non-employee, a client, a customer, someone attacking an employee, or an employee attacking another employee. There are some theories as to why it's becoming more prevalent. Um, Things like layoffs, mergers and acquisitions, and fewer jobs for advances lead to job insecurity and stress. And that's something we're definitely experiencing right now. Increases in diversity, they will also lead to racial prejudices and biases. So you might see some racially motivated issues of violence. And also increases in drug and alcohol abuse. Reduction in management is another problem that we're seeing a lot of, which equals reduced opportunities for multi-level communication. So you don't really have the hierarchy of layers. It's kind of just like the big boss and then everyone else. So all of these things can contribute to people getting angry and aggressive at work. And if you think about, again, I'm sorry to keep bringing it up, but this situation that we're in where there's a lot of quarantine and there's a lot of people working from home, there's a lot of people being laid off, you can imagine that this is possibly going to even increase even more. We find, one of the most common causes of workplace violence is that disgruntled employee who's been laid off coming back. So we definitely want to be mindful of that. There's some relationships, or there's some that theorize there's going to be relationships between low self-esteem and increased violence, because we thought, when self-esteem first became a big area of study among psychologists, we were interested in it because we thought, oh, if we increase people's self-esteem, all of these bad problems will go away and all of these good things will happen. We didn't actually find that in any of our research. Self-esteem has very few relationships with anything, but if anything, it's the other way around. People who have really, really high self-esteem and have big, egos, that narcissistic personality, may be more likely to be violent, and people who have high self-esteem, when you threaten that self-esteem, such as being laid off, that's when they're gonna act out violently, or not necessarily that they're going to, but the increased probability happens. Also, interpersonal conflict. So managers should always avoid using any kind of disrespectful or abusive language, which results in ego threat. Of course, managers don't do this. A lot of managers, we all have had those bosses and those managers who are absolutely just disrespectful to their employees, but for their own good. Not to sound like I'm making a threat myself, but managers should really avoid it because it can definitely trigger people who are prone to violent behavior. One study looked at workplace violence incidences, and it found that of people who perpetrated violence, 68% had psychiatric diagnoses. But the most common, of course, if you know anything about psychological disorders and violence, are personality disorders and substance abuse. Specifically substance abuse, if you actually separate everything out, has the highest correlation with violence and aggression. On no other mental illness has a relationship broadly with aggression besides substance abuse. Maybe some personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, which is very rare conditions to have, but those sometimes have, that's called like a psychopathy. Those are the people who may be more violent. But most mental illnesses and psychiatric problems actually have a negative relationship with violence and aggression. So the idea that, a mentally ill person is going to be aggressive or violent is actually a myth, unless you're referring to very specific disorders or substance abuse. Specifically, alcohol and drugs have high relationships, and I mean drugs like cocaine, heroin, like hard drugs, um, have relationships with violence. So anything else, those numbers, if there's a relationship, is probably there's some other factor at play. For example, depression often results in substance abuse. So I would definitely say that it's probably more the substance abuse, which is just what I know from broader literature outside of IO about relationships between mental illness and aggression. So keep that in mind. There are different levels of violence at work. So shootings, especially in the United States, of course, are highly publicized, and we hear and read and see about them a lot, and rightfully so because they're big deals. But they are not the most prevalent form of violence at work. We consider the most common level one violence to be things like refusal to cooperate, argumentative, and making inappropriate sexual remarks. So this is more of like a violence in a verbal sense, just being threatening with the things you say and do, but not actually hurting someone. Level two is a little bit more where you're increasingly argumentative, you don't comply with the company's policies, sabotaging or destroying equipment, sending sexual or violent notes, and theft. So this one is taking it to the next level where your violent person here is actually engaging in acts that are frightening, but they're not physically assaulting anyone yet. Then you have level three, which is where you actually get into very aggressive physical violent behavior, threats, destruction, assault, and using weapons. This is where it gets really bad. But most common, of course, level one, and then a little bit more or a little bit less than level one is level two, and then level three is rare, but definitely most frightening. And with anything, you would imagine that there is a bit of a build-up. You'd see someone who's going to be violent would probably start with level one. Of course, we have those famous cases of people who just snap and you think they're not going to do anything like that ever, and then they do. But truthfully, the majority of the time, there is some pattern of behavior. And these patterns can also be found in our understanding of who the typical type of person who would engage in violent behavior is. Now, again, like with anything in psychology, it's not 100%. And it also doesn't mean that every violent worker meets these criteria, nor does it mean that everyone who meets this criteria is violent. But these are some of the things that predict more likelihood towards violence. And they were found by these studies. So the first is people who barely ever participate in organizational events. They didn't go to the company picnic, they don't go to the parties, they don't participate at all. They don't have a lot of interests outside of the organization. They have histories of violence and conflict, like I said. Most of the time, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So people who have increasingly built up records of these types of violent and aggressive behaviors. Job insecurity is a big one, and man, is it a big one. People feeling like their jobs are not safe. They might be fired at any moment, which is really all of us right now. Relatively long tenure, so usually people who have been there a while, it's not brand new employees. Issues with accepting and relinquishing authority, and that may be why those lower levels of violence have a lot of stuff about being argumentative. People who just can't accept any type of authority, they think they should be in charge of everyone, they're prone to more violence than those who are a little bit more accepting. Of course, we don't want to give into authoritarianism completely, but being just downright combative for no reason is definitely a predictor of violence. And as I mentioned, again, alcohol abuse is a big one. Um, in fact, I think I read once that, can't remember the exact number, but I think it was somewhere around 60 or 70% of violent altercations to which the police are called, alcohol has been involved. So definitely be aware of that one. And of course, we all talk about this in the media and in our news and everything. There are some demographics who are just more likely to engage in violent behavior. We see in the United States, it's typically a white man between the ages of 25 and 50. Once again, want to remind you all, this is not a one-to-one. Not every person who engages in violent, aggressive behavior is a white man between 25 and 50. And of course, not every white man between 25 and 50 is going to engage in violent behavior. But the facts are the facts, and we know that most um, people who go and attack someone in their workplace, most people who commit shootings, acts of violence, and aggression, and serial killers even are in this specific demographic. Don't know why. Weirdly enough, psychologists don't spend probably as much time as they should looking into why this is, but there are some who study it, and you can look into that if you're interested. Um, and it is interesting to see how things that predict violence outside of work also kind of predict violence at work as well, with the exception, of course, of a few job related ones like job insecurity and these organizational factors. All right. Theories of workplace violence include the frustration aggression hypothesis, um, which is this idea that being frustrated can result in either destructive or constructive behavior. And it's a lot like the other stuff we talked about, stress, the challenge and hindrance stressors, the eustress versus distress. And it's contingent a lot on control. So that control factor really matters with violence as well. So this model represents what happens, the constraints that occur in your organization, whether feeling job insecurity, feeling just what for whatever reason lack of control, you'll get this feeling of dissatisfaction and frustration. But if you feel like you have some control over it, you'll be more constructive. And if you feel like you lack control, you'll move into more destructive behavior. And of course, not every time. This is just how the theory of how it can happen. It's pretty straightforward and intuitive to think about. Another thing to think about is the justice hypothesis, which actually contains a number of psychological, organizational psychology theories. So basically, that a lot of violent acts can be understood as a reaction that is against the perceived injustice. I have talked about this. We went over it a little bit when we talked about counterproductive work behaviors, where you're more likely to engage in them if you feel like something has been unfair. And this goes into social exchange theory, psychological contract, the norm of reciprocity. I've gone and talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to rehash all of that, but if you are interested, maybe look it up, search it, go back to a previous lecture, and these relate very much to this idea of justice. And that gets us into organizational justice theory, which is a very, very important theory in IO psychology, one of the most cited and most supported theories in IO psychology. And again, I think I brought it up briefly, but I'm going to kind of break it down really quick here for you. It's basically just how justice operates at work. There's a few different types of justice. There's distributive justice, which refers to the fairness of how things are distributed at work. So is everyone getting the same treatment in terms of, pay? Is everyone getting the same treatment and in the outcomes? Basically, think about how distributing things fairly. So is the organization distributing their resources fairly among all employees? So they're getting the same support, they're getting the same outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. The next type is procedural justice, which is the processes, the ways that the organization makes decisions and the processes they engage in, do they seem fair? That's really critical too. So if you want to think of it more of like procedural as a process and distributed as an outcome, that's one way to distinguish them. Third is interpersonal justice, which is how people are treated and interacted with by the organization. And it's actually broken down into two subfacets, which are interactional justice and informational justice. And interactional justice is how you're treated with respect by your employers, And then informational justice is, do they tell you what's going on? So it's pretty straightforward. And I encourage you to look more into it as well. This would be a good one to cite in some of your papers or just to talk about in the discussion board. And I didn't write out everything on the slides here, so feel free to, dig a little deeper and talk about how, just like anything in life, we want things to be fair and just at work, and how that's going to influence how we perceive our workplace, how we're motivated, how we want to act towards our employer and coworkers. It's definitely a huge factor, and it's very, very much supported. So definitely give that one your attention and think about it a little bit more. And I'm sure a lot of us are feeling a little bit at a loss about how, if anything, is what's going on fair and just. Even though, of course, we can't control the broader social global problem we're having right now, the responses to it, the way governments and organizations are responding, is that justice? Give that, just think about that a little bit, and think about how employees might respond, whether they feel that they're getting those different types of justices or not. So one more type of violence that I want to talk about is bullying, which is a specific type of violence. So as opposed to broad violence, which is like, the most stereotypic, I guess, example we can think of is a worker who comes in and just, commits a shooting, as horrifying as it is, because they're angry and they want to lash out. Bullying is a very targeted type of violence. It's not generalized to just, I want to blow up on someone. It's, I have this specific person that I want to harass. Bullying is defined as harassing, offending, excluding, or humiliating a person repeatedly over a long period of time. And it is widespread. This happens all over the place, unfortunately. People cope with bullying usually through third-party involvement, such as therapy or social support, because it's kind of hard to address bullying at work, usually because they're afraid of their bullies or their bully has power over them. And mobbing is a situation where bullying is, as the name suggests, a large group of people bullying one target. Unfortunately, this happens a lot at work as well. We like to pick, as humans, for some reason, we like to pick someone to pick on, and that happens in the workplace. And it's definitely something that management should get involved and try to prevent. Employees should support each other, but it can be a big issue because a lot of times companies aren't paying attention to it, or they're even participating in it. So it's definitely something that, we still need more researchers to be doing studies on interventions for, because it's hard to predict and it's hard to prevent. So that's why, a lot of the coping is more on that third party involvement. So in conclusion about workplace violence, we know it's increasing a little bit, and that could be because of this insecurity issues that are rising and spiked now. But we need opportunities for employees to voice these concerns in terms of fairness and justice, because being proactive, as we know from the previous video, and being vigilant and aware and being prepared are the best way to handle anything like this. So think about incidences of violence that think about bullying and how you might come up with a way to prevent or mediate or mitigate those issues. And that concludes the lectures on workplace stress and well-being. And I am tired of talking to my computer screen. So hopefully these videos are helpful to you guys. If not, that's okay. Just hope you guys are doing well. Please reach out to me if you need anything. I will see you on the next lecture. And I hope you have a good week and you play some video games or watch some movies or do something to reduce your stress.